The Eyes of the Killer Robot by John Bellairs, Chapter 3. Fergie and Johnny said yes enthusiastically. Around 10:30 the next morning, the two boys and the professor were standing outside Chigwell's pawn shop. 3 golden globes hung from a bracket over the door, and propped up behind the plate glass display window were 2 guitars, a saxophone, a velvet-covered board with several antique watches hanging on it, and an old cavalry saber. There was also an enormous meerschaum pipe covered with carved satyrs and nymphs, and a brass-lined wastebasket made from the foot of a rhinoceros. After the 3 of them had studied the things in the window for a few minutes, the professor coughed loudly and said, "Come along, gentlemen, time's a-wasting." He went into the shop, and Fergie and Johnny followed him. The owner of the shop was a small, bald, meek-looking man who wore half-moon glasses and an unbuttoned gray vest. The professor marched straight up to the man, introduced himself, and fished the pawn ticket out of his pocket. When the man saw the ticket, his eyes opened wide. "Good night!" he exclaimed as he took the piece of paper from the professor's hand. "I didn't expect to see one of these again. Where on earth did you get it?" The professor smiled uncomfortably and glanced away. "It's a long story. I won't bore you with it. To tell the truth, I'm amazed that you recognize the ticket. I know it seems unlikely, but I wonder if it's possible that you still have the object that the ticket belongs to." The pawnbroker stared hard at the ticket and scratched the side of his nose. He muttered. "You know, there is an outside chance that we might have it. You see, this ticket comes from my grandfather's time, and a few years ago we gave away or sold a lot of the stuff left over from the old days, but I saved a few rather curious objects that I just couldn't bear to get rid of. They're in a closet in the back room. Here, let me go have a look." The pawnbroker took the ticket and disappeared through the curtained doorway. A few minutes later, he came back with an old-fashioned walking stick in his hands. The body of the cane was made of some mottled light brown wood, and it was capped at the bottom by a tarnished brass ferrule. For a handle, the cane had a piece of ivory that was shaped like a long, skinny human hand, and the fingers of the hand clutched an ivory ball. Attached to the handle was an old, tattered cardboard tag with the number 896 on it. "Good grief!" gasped the professor. "So that's our prize, eh? Well, well." "That's it," said the man with a little sigh. He laid the cane on the counter, turned, and plucked a dust rag down from a shelf. As Fergie and Johnny crowded in to stare at the cane, the man began wiping the dust off it. "It's been in that closet back there ever since I can remember," he said. "When I was a kid playing in the back of this shop, I used to take it out and fool around with it, but I always made sure my dad didn't know what I was doing. It's a dangerous thing, you see." The professor stared at him blankly. "Dangerous? How do you mean?" The pawnbroker smiled and gripped the ivory handle firmly. He tugged, and out came a thin, springy sword blade. "Wow!" exclaimed Fergie. "I've always wanted to have one of those. Can I see it?" The man handed the sword to Fergie, and he turned it back and forth in the light. Running the whole length of the blade on both sides were fancy engraved decorations, whorls and squiggles and loops that looked like complicated Boy Scout knots. Fergie tested the edge of the blade with his finger. It was razor sharp. "Boy," said Fergie, grinning wickedly, "you could sure use this to get a seat on the bus, couldn't you?" The professor winced. "Yes, I suppose you could, Byron," he said. "And you could also use it to get yourself a seat in the county jail. Carrying a concealed weapon is against the law, and that sword cane qualifies as a concealed weapon. Rich gentlemen used to carry them in the old days when there were no streetlights and thugs lurked in every alley." He turned to the pawnbroker and reached into his hip pocket for his wallet. "How much do you want for this thing, eh?" The pawnbroker shrugged and smiled. "Take it, it's yours. People always think that pawnbrokers are greedy, so I like to prove them wrong sometimes. Anyway, since you found the ticket, I'd say the cane was meant to be yours. Wouldn't you agree?" The professor was surprised and pleased, and he insisted on giving the man a $10 bill. Then he turned to Fergie, who was still fiddling with the sword. "Young Byron is really the one who found the ticket," he said. "So by rights, he ought to have the cane. Doesn't that seem reasonable to you, John?" Johnny nodded. "Sure, I think Fergie ought to have it." Fergie grinned appreciatively, but then he seemed to have second thoughts. He frowned and shook his head. "Nah, Prof, you ought to take it," he said thoughtfully. "My mom is always worried that I'll turn into a juvenile delinquent, and if she finds out I have a toad sticker like this, she'll think I'm going to be getting a zip gun next. Thanks, but no thanks." The professor sighed and accepted the gift. After the pawnbroker had wrapped the cane in brown paper and tied it with string. The professor tucked it under his arm, and the three of them left the shop. As they were walking down the street to the professor's car, a battered blue Ford came cruising slowly past, and went round the traffic circle in front of the post office, and then came rolling back past the professor's maroon Pontiac. The professor, Johnny, and Fergie were standing by the car discussing the parking ticket that the professor had gotten. Well, they were in the pawn shop. They didn't notice the Ford as it passed them a second time. It rolled down Washington Street, then turned onto a bumpy potholed alley that ran between two abandoned factories. The car halted, and the two people inside glanced around to see if anyone was watching them. But the alley was totally empty. "Are you sure that's the Dixon boy?" asked the driver. She was a burly, bossy-looking old woman with bunchy gray hair, and she wore a white uniform, the kind that nurses in hospitals wear, and steel-rimmed spectacles. Her eyes were hard. "Yes, that's the little snot. That's him for sure," said her passenger, a tall old man with a mop of white hair. The skin of the man's face was loose and saggy, and near the end of his long pointed nose was a wart the size of a pea. The man's eyes were watery and red-rimmed, and sometimes he would glare fiercely this way and that for no reason at all. "It's certainly him, no doubt about it," the man went on in a clipped voice that sounded vaguely British. "I wish that we were ready to take him now, but my project's just not finished. These old hands of mine won't obey their master the way they used to. You don't hold it against me that I'm working so slowly, do you?" The woman glanced contemptuously at the man, and she seemed to be on the point of saying something nasty, but she forced her mouth into a cold smile. "No, my dearest, I don't mind. If the final result is going to be good, you ought to take all the time you need. But tell me, is that little cranky-looking old man the boy's grandfather?" The man shook his head. "No, Henry Dixon is about as tall as I am. I saw him the other day watering his lawn, and I recognized him immediately." Suddenly the man seemed to be seized with fierce anger. He clenched his long, pale hands on his knees and ground his teeth. "I wish I had him here in this alley," he muttered bitterly. "I'd wring his neck and leave him for the dogs to mangle. I hate him. I hate him now more than I did all those years ago. Filthy, rotten, lying, dirt-eating." Now," said the woman soothingly. "You mustn't allow yourself to get too angry. Remember what that doctor told you about your heart. You needn't worry. You'll get your revenge in due time. Meanwhile, I think we might as well go back to my place. I'll fix us some lunch. Then I'll drive you back up north, and you can work on our little project again. I'll keep an eye on young Mr. Dixon until we're ready to use him." The old man said nothing. His face was still red and twisted with rage, and he went on clawing at his knees. After a quick glance at him, the woman shrugged and started the car. And we will pause there.